Greetings, I'm Dack Rouleau.
I'm Christy Rouleau.
And this is the Overwritten Book Club. We are finally here for the season finale of our reading of Machiavelli's The Prince. We want to thank our audience for joining us for this first season of the book club. We know we've had some hiccups as far as the scheduling and the timing of the releases is concerned, but that doesn't really matter because the discussion goes on regardless. So tonight we will be reviewing the final, 6 chapters of The Prince?
Chapter 21 through 26, I believe.
Right, so we're reading this book that was published about 500 years ago to try to see what it can teach us about the modern political climate, and we have learned in the first 4 episodes of the book club that it has taught us quite a lot. So we are going to begin with a quote about neutrality. This is from one of the final 5 or 6 chapters of the book, and I will just read it right now. Quote, "It is always the case that the one who is not your friend will request your neutrality, and that the one who is your friend will request your armed support. Princes who are irresolute usually follow the path of neutrality in order to escape immediate danger, and usually they come to grief." So this was interesting for us, having had some experience with activist circles, with some of the political ideologues, people in the independent media. Whenever you are going to state a controversial position, we learned the hard way, people are going to come out and say, well, why don't you not be quite so bold in that? Why don't you try to remain neutral so as not to rock the boat among fellow activists who are fighting to make a difference? And what we found invariably was that when people are telling you to do so, they're not saying so out of compassion or concern or camaraderie. They're doing so in order to try to, they're really trying to do so in order to avoid having to take some kind of definitive moral position.
Right, and in this specific sense, we're talking about something that's wrong within these activist circles, something, not that you're an activist who's trying to wrong a worldly right, but something within that activist circle is going wrong, and you want to speak up about that. It's in our situation, in our experience, it is usually subdued and discouraged. I think it's interesting because we did exactly what Machiavelli says to do. You know, we did not take the path of neutrality, but we did still experience grief.
Yeah, there is a sense, I think, that when someone is trying to request your neutrality, there's almost like a moral censorship that's going on. People are afraid to actually come out and say, okay, I'm willing to put things on the line for my principles. Instead of doing so, they're trying to hide behind the supposed virtue of neutrality. But what Machiavelli observes, I think rightly, is that is just, it's a way of putting off the inevitable, which is that point of departure. Someone who's trying to tell you to be neutral all the time will eventually betray you when the chips are down.
Right. They aren't really your friend. They don't really have compassion for you, as you said, and they really are just trying to play both sides of the coin until it's advantageous for them.
And I think that in the broader, mainstream political culture, you see examples of that too. In the lead up to the last election, there were a lot of progressives and other well-meaning people who were disgusted by the unnatural way in which Joe Biden was nominated, but they were told to just be quiet, remain neutral in their feelings, and to support the Democratic Party establishment in the end. Right. Well, those who did so, we see what that got them, which is absolutely nothing.
Yeah, all the promises made by the Democrats and Joe Biden have not come to fruition, and it really was, they were told to support the Democrats, even if you're a progressive, just support the ticket. We just need to defeat Trump.
Yeah, and there are examples of that with the Republican Party too. We in the independent media, there's a sort of an expectation that you're going to be trashing the Democrats all day long in order to prove that you're, I don't know, woke or something. But do you remember in 2012, Republicans, there was an effort that you had to vote for Mitt Romney no matter what, because the most important thing, our greatest imperative, was to get Obama, the socialist, out of the White House.
Yes. I think as the Ron Paul people definitely were convinced, or well, they were trying to convince the Ron Paul people to stick with the party when they were like, I'm done, I'm not doing this, I'm not going Romney. Like that was a big movement to try to keep those people there.
Yeah, and we're going to see more of that in 2024. There's already discussions about whether it is in the Republican Party's best interest for Donald Trump to run. Some people have argued, I think persuasively, that Ron DeSantis would probably be a better choice than Donald Trump, but because Trump has the I don't know if institutional power is the right term, but because because he has the clout behind him, people are going to be expected to fall in line and support him, and even though it may not be in their best interest to do so. So yeah, this idea that neutrality is somehow a sign of goodwill or good faith or support, Machiavelli discredits that in just a couple of sentences.
Yes, yeah.
So with that being said, we'll move on to another quote of Machiavelli's. This is where he's talking about joining up with someone in an alliance. Quote, "Here it is to be noted that a prince should never join in an aggressive alliance with someone more powerful than himself unless it is a matter of necessity. This is because, if you are the victors, you emerge as his prisoner, and princes should do their utmost to escape being at the mercy of others." So this seems to quite obviously play into what we were just talking about, that the Bernie supporters and the Tulsi supporters and the other progressives were told in the last election cycle they needed to shut up and accept Joe Biden as the nominee in order to get some of what they wanted after he won the general election. But as you observed, they got absolutely nothing. And so the question is, what did they become if not Joe Biden's prisoner?
Right. And I think specifically we see the prisoners, and not that he got really a position in the administration, but Bernie Sanders really did become yet again another prisoner of the DNC and just, turned into a company man. Maybe he always was, but I think he really just by, convincing him to go out, do a show, then come back and support Biden, really just is an example of that.
Right. Bernie, when people called him a sheepdog, the pejorative term aside, I think it was an accurate description. Mm-hmm. He was there to try to generate enthusiasm among young, liberal-minded and progressive-minded people, and then convince them to come over to the establishment side after the primary contest, after the nominating contest. Right. And there was, which is why I think that the Democratic Party establishment probably wanted him to run in 2020. I saw recently that I think it was it might have been Chuck Schumer or another prominent Democrat had actually supported Bernie Sanders' initial Senate run back in 2006. So yeah, there are questions about whether he had the establishment on his side, but I think the point is that if you are capitulating to the establishment, you are going to find that the establishment does not take care of you after you do them their favors.
Who else do you think became a prisoner of the establishment after 2020?
Well, if Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had any political independence, she certainly does not now. You can see how she's a company woman. Tulsi Gabbard's incredibly ill-advised endorsement of Joe Biden would suggest that she was part of the winning team.
Yeah, I feel like she is too, even though she's not currently in the government now. I do feel like ultimately that is what happened to her.
I had done a video a while ago about why I was glad Nina Turner lost, because it would discourage people from her fans from joining this establishment. But also in the context of the activist circles of which you and I have been a part, and the independent media, there is an expectation that you must capitulate to the establishment. When I did my video on this channel several months ago criticizing Jimmy Dore, there were people who responded very clearly saying, hey, wait, Jimmy Dore he's one of the good guys. You can't be criticizing him. Right. But if you capitulate to Jimmy Dore and kiss up to him, what is it that you actually gain from that? You certainly don't gain anything intellectually.
No, you don't gain any notoriety. You don't gain any extra followers. You don't. I mean, maybe you get, if Jimmy Dore acknowledges you might get a little share of his wealth of followers. But I mean, ultimately, it's not pushing you forward.
No, just because Jimmy Dore or Caitlin Johnstone retweets you, that doesn't mean that you're actually sharing in their fame or wealth or success. So yeah, there's an establishment even in the subcultures, and that's something people need to recognize. So now we will move beyond that and get into a little bit more of rather than the independent media, the sort of broader political culture. Here's an interesting quote. A prince should also show his esteem for talent, actively encouraging able men, and honoring those who excel in their profession. Then he must encourage his citizens so that they can go peaceably about their business, whether it be trade or agriculture or any other human occupation. One man should not be afraid of improving his possessions, lest they be taken away from him, or another deterred by high taxes from starting a new business. So this obviously does not adequately describe the Biden economy, does it?
No, not at all. That's very interesting. Yeah, and what we're seeing with the Build Back Better bill, and I got a spam phone call actually today with a voicemail about call now and find out what the tax compromise plan means for you. And like, I think they're trying to
nothing good.
Yeah, trying to encourage people that this is something good, but honestly, people who own their own business or is trying to pursue anything new are going to be discouraged by this.
Yeah, one man should not be afraid of improving his possessions lest they be taken away from him, or another deterred by high taxes from starting a new business. Well, deterred by high taxes from starting a new business, that is the Biden economy, is it not? I mean, everyone is living under the crippling, crushing thumb of the government. Right. And the idea that one should not be afraid of improving his possessions lest they be taken away from him. What I actually thought about with this was not business per se, but deplatforming. The idea that if you're creating a YouTube channel where you're speaking unfiltered truth, to borrow a cliche, you run a very serious risk that you will be deplatformed and censored because it's inappropriate. The idea that the better you are, the more unstable and insecure your channel becomes.
Right. The more people that tune into you and the more notice you get, the more popularity you get, it could be pulled away from you in an instant.
And then this quote, he must encourage his citizens so that they can go peaceably about their business. Well, that is definitely not the COVID economy, is it? No. Every single industrial sphere has been threatened by the government's seemingly unstoppable reach in the time of the pandemic.
Right. We have these mandates that are supposed to take effect January 4th that have been tripped up by multiple federal judges and different court circuits in different states. But Biden says, no, employers, go ahead and keep moving forward, keep controlling your citizens, keep controlling your employees with these mandates. We don't want people here in the Biden administration, in the Biden realm, to have freedom in any way, shape, or form.
No, and as someone else observed, many people have observed, it's interesting how they are firing nurses and doctors for refusing the vaccine during the time of the pandemic. This idea that encouraging citizens so they can go peaceably about their business, this governmental overreach that is in our own times, it's not about conservatism or libertarianism. Machiavelli would argue it's just good sense for the government to stay out of it.
Right.
And this idea that the prince should show his esteem for talent, actively encouraging able men and honoring those who excel in their profession. That's very different from our modern celebration of mediocrity, isn't it?
Right. And our modern interpretation of affirmative action and having equal parts genders, equal parts races, equal parts this. Like, we just are checking boxes. We're not really looking at who is the most intelligent, who's the most talented, who is the best fit for these positions. Yeah,
the idea of ability and merit, it's been completely subsumed by categorical representation. The idea of ability, that is not something we see really in any sphere. Even in the even in the independent media, it's not really about how articulate you are. It's not about how thoughtful you are. It's about how clearly and simply you adhere to the broadest political perspective.
Yeah, I just that speaks to so much of what has gone wrong in the last decade of like this SJW, just constant anger and like white knighting that has gone on, and how things should be, how they should not, and nobody is being left alone to do their thing. Like we live in a culture where they want you to believe that, like, oh, everybody's celebrated, everybody can be who they want to be just you, but not really. Not if you go against the cultural movement of the leftist,
right, the cultural majority.
Yeah.
So we also have some interesting quotes here about the function of government. These are always interesting to me as we're reading The Prince, because I think so much of the independent media and that kind of political activism, I think it focuses on what we, the people, want rather than how government is actually administered. And so I thought that reading The Prince was refreshing in that sense because it focused on the people at the top rather than the people on the bottom.
Yeah, I think... The Prince was very interesting to me because I think people use Machiavelli in a term of sort of like this, like, devil, evil, like this is what like evil empires and dictators use. And we also like to at the same time think that the United States government is evil and an empire. But we have found so many quotes in so many places in this book where we're like, the U.S. is not following even this basic principle of Machiavelli in this book. Like, our evil empire isn't even adhering to this.
Yeah, I think that Machiavelli has become a synonym for competent evil, whereas the United States government seems to me to be incompetent evil.
It's more chaotic.
Yeah, there's this sort of, again, in some of the political spheres in which you and I have moved, there's an expectation that you're supposed to say that our government is all-knowing and that they're calculating in what they're doing, and they're very, very expert in their tyrannical exertions. But reading The Prince has really made me question their wisdom. I'm not sure that the people who run our government are really as competent or thoughtful as we are led to believe. I don't think they know what they're doing.
Yeah, I don't think the left hand knows what the right hand's doing most of the time.
No, so let's get into one of the quotes. Right here. A man entrusted with the task of government must never think of himself but of the prince, and must never concern himself with anything except the prince's affairs. So we didn't explain it in this video, but for those who have followed the book club up to this point, when Machiavelli talks about the prince, he's talking about the sovereign head of state. We could say he's a king, he's a president, a prime minister, etc. But this idea that a man entrusted with the task of government must never think of himself but of the prince, this shows that people in government, their loyalty is not to the people, their loyalty is to the institution of government. It's to the institution of the state.
And I would say, because this section of the book talks about who is the right type of person to work for the prince, and who is the right type of person to efficiently carry out the prince's wants, needs, affairs, orders. I would say our government doesn't do that, because when we elect somebody into government, typically they're not even thinking about the good of the government or the institution. They end up thinking about themselves. Yeah. Because you've got lobbyists and corporations that start invading and slipping them money and influencing them. So ultimately, we see people like Nancy Pelosi, who have been in government for how long, and create millions of dollars and create these lucrative careers. Not just they have been civil servants and live comfortably. These people are millionaires when they get to this age.
Well, it's also there's a question of whether their ongoing presence is really helpful for that institution, because Nancy Pelosi, there's a reason why Nancy Pelosi can never run for president, because she would lose in a landslide. It's because there are obviously people who like her, but she is also, in a broader sense, deeply unpopular. Back in 2016 with Hillary Clinton, it was obvious that it was not a good idea for her to run for president, because she has inspired so much animosity across the national board. But she's pursuing power anyway for her own ends. In the Biden administration right now, Kamala Harris, extremely unpopular figure, but there's an expectation that she's going to run for president in just a few years because she wants to satisfy her own lust for power. This seems to me, it's not explicitly opposed to what Machiavelli talks about there, but it doesn't seem to be in complete accord with Machiavellian principles either.
No, and I think, like many of these people, they check off certain boxes that the people want to see fulfilled. AOC checked off so many boxes that people want to see fulfilled.
You're talking about like categorical representation. She's a woman, she's kind of color, she's progressive, etc.
Yeah, and so
she's hip.
And Machiavelli doesn't talk about those being good characteristics of people who could fulfill the prince's orders and the affairs.
Right. All right, so let's go to the next quote. Though many suppose that a prince may rightly be esteemed shrewd, not because he is so himself, but because of the quality of those there to advise him, they are undoubtedly mistaken. For this is an infallible rule. A prince who is not himself wise cannot be well advised, unless he happens to put himself in the hands of one individual who looks after all his affairs and is an extremely shrewd man. In this case, he may well be given good advice, but he would not last long, because the man who governs for him would soon deprive him of his state. So this quote, to me, was reminiscent of what we were told about we need to elect Joe Biden and then move him left. The idea that he was going to be susceptible to political influence. Now, even if it were somehow possible for us to influence Joe Biden or any other politician, doesn't it raise questions about why we need such a shapeless, susceptible, gullible person to be put into power in the first place?
Right. And then that also begs the question, how would such a shapeless, gullible person get to that point to be in power? It just, you can't have it both ways.
Right. Why are we having this massive jelly elected to the highest office? If it is, in fact, possible, what the establishment says, that we can move Biden left or move other figures right, or, we can exercise our own volition, that suggests that the political process in this country is deeply flawed. Like I think we've spent so much time on this channel focusing on how ridiculous the idea of moving Biden left is. Even if we accept, I think this is time for us to say, what if it's true? Isn't that even more disturbing?
Right. We've heard this a lot, especially in the Assange community with, we got to convince Trump to free Assange. We've got to convince now Biden to free Assange. We got to convince him to drop the charges. And we don't want to stop and think that these are establishment figures that are not going to go against what the establishment has spent billions of dollars doing. And so, if somebody who was president got in and then suddenly changed their mind on such a big issue, what are they doing there? How did they get there? What else can they easily be swayed to do in the wrong direction?
Misled. It kind of raises question about the stability of our political system and our governmental system. Reading this book, it's making me even more of a political cynic. I didn't think I could become any more cynical in my view of the American political system, but this book really just gives you all the more reason to reject it. Seriously, if a politician really was so feeble-minded that a couple of activists banging on the doors of some representative's office could really sway that person to say, I think I'm going to change my position on this. That really paints a disturbing portrait about how our society is run. I don't know that you can take politics seriously if that premise is correct. It's almost, reading this book almost makes me say, thank God our political system is not like that.
Right. And then in that turn, isn't it more important to vote for the people that actually show us how they feel about these topics? Isn't it more important to not just vote for Joe Biden because he's popular and has been there forever? If he doesn't agree with what you feel is important, isn't it more important to vote for the person who you feel is actually talking about those issues?
This to me just deepens my understanding of what is wrong with our political system. I can't read this book and think of one positive thing to say about the American political system. Can you?
No.
All right, well, let's go on to the next quote right here. Here we are. We do not find men falling down just because they expect to find someone helping them up. It may not happen. And if it does happen, it leaves you unsafe because your expedient was cowardly and not based on your own actions. So this is an interesting point where we were talking about the idea that we need to appeal to the people in power. We need to capitulate to them and try to influence them, move Biden left, move Trump right, left, whatever that we're supposed to be doing at that moment. This idea that we're appealing to our own sense of helplessness. Some of the political activists with which we've had some business, they seem to find this to be a virtue for them. Machiavelli seems to argue that it is most definitely not.
No, because you're leaving yourself open to basically being manipulated and taken advantage of because you're showing cowardice.
Right, this is what he was talking about earlier, about how you should never join in an aggressive alliance with someone more powerful than yourself. This idea that you're leaving yourself helpless and expecting to be picked up later, that the wise and shrewd advisors will guide you out of this mess, that is just an incredibly infantile way to live.
Yeah, because then, it just kind of leads down the road, then what will you be used for?
Yeah.
What will you be turned into? What sort of patsy will you become? How will you be a useful idiot for someone?
So there's an interesting quote here about the failure of dogmatism and ideology. Let's read this one. One man proceeds with circumspection, another impetuously. One uses violence, another stratagem. One goes about things patiently, another does the opposite, and yet everyone, for all this diversity of method, can reach his objective. This results from nothing else except the extent to which their methods are or are not suited to the nature of the times. This is interesting to me because in these independent media spheres, there is a very, very rigid and uncompromising dogmatism. People say that only their particular political ideologies are valid, and if you deviate from that in any way, then you are untrustworthy or something. Machiavelli says that there are all sorts of different ways to accomplish your goal. It depends on the circumstances in which you find yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is definitely not our culture that we exist in right now. Because I do think there has to be the mainstream cultural approved way of doing things. If you are a conservative woman and you become successful, if you're a conservative business person and you become successful, that is not the right way to do it.
Right, we're told that's not the right way to do it, is what you mean.
Yes.
There's a moral judgment.
There's this moral judgment, but it's like a collective moral judgment that the media wants you to think is being made.
Yeah.
They don't want you to think that you can do it this way or you can do it that way. You got to do it our way.
Right.
Everybody's got to go over here on this side.
Well, that was the point of the wildly successful video that I released about 4chan's assault on the trailer for Santa Inc. Is that people would be horrified by what 4chan said with all of that, shall we say, controversial humor. But I think that was reaching people where they are. You see people who are frustrated by this politically correct, multiculturalist insincerity that we see in the media, and so 4chan with its edgy, inflammatory, irreverent humor offers a kind of antidote to that.
Right.
It's not to say that that kind of offensive humor is appropriate in all situations, but in this particular situation it was an effective antidote.
Right. Dave Chappelle's another good example of somebody
yes.
who wants to talk about these issues, but you can't talk about them this way.
Right.
The way he's talking about it deserves to be canceled,
yes.
and he should not be allowed to have any sort of platform or speak to anybody like that.
Well, I think that was one of the things that came up during the pandemic was at one point Trump had said that it didn't seem fair that some people could not afford health insurance during the time of COVID, but others could. In that instance, he seemed to be almost left-wing in his views on healthcare, but that may have been seen as a betrayal of his alt-right ideology. But in a way, I thought he was reaching people where they were. They were desperate in the pandemic, and he was trying to show, maybe not trying to show, but inadvertently he showed that he could almost commiserate with his ideological opponents.
Right.
And there was also that sense with the independent media spheres in which we've moved, is there's this idea that everyone has to be echoing the same exact words about, say, Julian Assange. Everyone has to say this assault on freedom of the press is a threat to the First Amendment. There's no sense of creativity.
No.
That kind of uniformity is tiring.
Yeah, we're all saying the same thing. We're all saying what it's going to violate, the First Amendment. We're all saying that this is a press freedom issue. And the numerous videos and articles that are done on Julian Assange every week are parroting each other.
Mm-hmm. So you actually had a quote that we were going to read before we came to our final quote. So why don't you go ahead and read this? This is about men pursuing fortune.
Yeah, I hold strongly to this, that it is better to be impetuous than circumspect, because fortune is a woman, and if she is to be submissive, it is necessary to beat and coerce her. Experience shows that she is more often subdued by men who do this than by those who act coldly. Always being a woman, she favors young men because they are less circumspect and more ardent, and because they command her with greater audacity. So
he's speaking of fortune as a woman in that sense, and saying that one must be bold and pursue her with aggression. So what do you think about that?
I thought it was a good quote. It's in the second to last chapter, and I really thought it actually really summarized the book really well. I was actually surprised when I realized I still had another chapter to go, because I thought it was a good way to end the book. I think it's obviously not PC to use that quote now, because it's talking about fortune in a very gendered way. But I think that's what he was saying this whole time. I think that's Machiavelli's point, is that all these different things he goes through about a prince and how the prince has to be or shouldn't be come down to this, on like, this is how you use fortune, and if you don't do it this way, it's not going to work out for you. And typically it's going to be a younger man who can do it.
Yeah, passivity is not going to get you anywhere. You have to be bold, you have to be definitive, and you have to be directed in your goals. You have to have that sense of ambition. You mentioned how this seemed like a perfect ending for the book. I believe they mentioned in the introduction that was the original ending to the book, and then the final chapter was an appendage added on later.
Right, yeah, because he's kind of writing this as a letter, and kind of, there was that addition.
Right, postscript. Yes. So that was an example I tried to set when I was confronting the presidential candidates about Julian Assange. I tried to go out, take the initiative, and be innovative in going and creating something that literally no one else was willing to do.
And no one did.
Right, the idea of everyone else was just sitting behind a computer blathering in passivity and timidity and dullness. I tried to go out and do something that was striking and unique and memorable. And even if people don't appreciate it, I certainly appreciated the experience for myself. It taught me a lot because there was a sense of positive action. It wasn't just lying back and reviewing things and commenting on things. Yeah. And I like to think we took that initiative by reading this book. We didn't just allow somebody else to read a book for us. We said, we're going to read this book. And that's why we encouraged our audience to read it too. We wanted to see our audience ask questions and participate in the reading because we wanted them to take that initiative. So did you have anything else to say about that quote? Okay. Then we will read this final quote here. Men are won over by the present far more than by the past, and when they decide that what is being done here and now is good, they content themselves with that and do not go looking for anything else. So Machiavelli actually says this in the sense that we should appeal to the present and not worry about other eras. But I wanted to talk about this in the sense that we read this really old book, this book that's 500 years old, to try to obtain some sense of understanding about our present political culture. And when I first read this book over 3 years ago, I thought it was far more effective in helping me to understand the present political culture than anything that has been written today, anything that's been written within the last 5 years. How did you feel having read this for the first time now?
I thought it was very interesting to see the ideas and events of today through this lens of 500 years ago. And also, like we mentioned before in this video and other videos, how really sort of asinine the United States is, that they're not even following like any sort of past logic of how to really be an effective prince and empire. It gave me kind of a new look at just sort of the organized chaos that our government is, I guess.
So did you think that the book felt dated in any way? Did you think that it felt like inaccessible because of how old it was?
No, I actually didn't. And even he does spend a lot of time talking about specific people and leaders at this time. I still felt like there was and maybe it's just because we had been discussing it so much and we're a little bit more attuned to history to interpret it that way, but I didn't feel like it was inaccessible to somebody reading it now.
No, I don't think so at all. I think if anything, the fact that it doesn't touch on some of our modern issues like categorical representation and all of that other foolishness, to me, that just means the book is unobstructed. It isn't clouded and muddled by all of these frivolous, unproductive conversations that we have.
There is no like technological dating of this book. They're talking about really basic fundamental things that are as we've done with these 5 episodes can span centuries. We're not talking about things that may be here and gone in the next 20 years.
And it also enriches your appreciation of other works and other media. We actually, on your suggestion, we were watching some of the Showtime program, The Borgias, which came out about a decade ago, something like that. And obviously you don't have to read The Prince to appreciate The Borgias, and you don't have to watch The Borgias to appreciate The Prince. But just this idea that they're seeing the artistic and intellectual influence beyond the immediate borders of the book. That was that's something that I find rewarding, that will help you with anything you read in the future.
Yeah, and if you go back and watch these episodes that we've done, we talk a lot about that Machiavelli speaks to the Borgia Pope and his son, and ultimately I still think, and I said this maybe in episode 2 or 3, that Machiavelli considers Cesare Borgia to be the like pinnacle of the prince at the time. And so it is interesting to then we've been reading a little bit about his history beyond the prince, and then seeing the Borgias come to life. And so I think it is a good idea to expose yourself to these things, because you don't know what it's going to lead you to. You don't know what's going to pique your interest. And ultimately, it's just going to keep you continuing to learn and read and intake more information.
Well, as we were talking, I noticed that I have that volume of Orwell on the bookcase behind me. I'm trying to aim my finger perfectly. But yeah, it's the idea that, okay, that's another political thinker from a different time. People love to quote him constantly. Maybe people should quote Machiavelli a little bit more often. Yep. And maybe we will in the future. So with that being said, that will bring the first season of the Overwritten Book Club to a close. And we would like to thank our audience very much for watching all of these episodes of the Overwritten Book Club. Please consider subscribing to this channel and helping to increase Overwritten's visibility. So we're not going to stop the book club. The book club will be back, but it's going to take a few months. We're going to decide which book we want to read. We haven't decided yet, but we'll give you guys about a month's notice before we get into the book so that you can get a copy, read it yourself, because we want you to read these books yourselves. We want you to join us in reading and create a more literate culture in society. So we're kind of debating between a couple of different books, but we'll discuss that behind closed doors. The prince should never reveal everything he's thinking to the masses. And it just really thank you to those of you, as few or as many as you are, who did watch the Overwritten Book Club. It has really been a really fun experience with this first season, reading The Prince, Machiavelli, and everything else. Anything you wanted to say to the audience?
I was going to say, we had a lot of new subscribers in the last week.
Yes.
I think we're over 350 new subscribers and still growing. So if this is your first episode of the Overwritten Book Club, you can read The Prince. It's not that long. I mean, this is even with some extra appendages and forward. It's a very simple, accessible book, and you can rewatch our episodes. We did 5 of this book. And like you said, we're going to do another book and continue this on. So don't be discouraged. Jump back to the old episodes and check them out.
We reward repeat viewings. There's a playlist also for the Overwritten Book Club, and there will be for season 2. So with that being said, we will just say to our audience, thank you very much and good night.
Good night.